Good afternoon, I'm Jordan Roth, and thank you for watching episode 30 of DALLÄSTHETIC podcast. With me today is Marilyn Waligore. Marilyn, hi, welcome.
Thank you, Jordan. Thank you for the invitation. I'm pleased to be able to talk about my recent work.
Absolutely. We're really excited because Marilyn Waligore has a show upcoming at Row 2 Art in downtown, at the Downtown Pop-Up, called Post Convenience. And it's a continuation of series that she's worked on they're works in photography, but there's a lot of media that that kind of goes into it, and you'll see a little bit of what we're talking about soon. But tell me first a little bit about your background. How did you get into being a photographer?
My background is actually in drawing, painting, and printmaking, and I studied art. I was fortunate enough to be able to study painting as a young person, as a child, and never stopped creating art. So it was just a natural progression to study art in college, and then perhaps because we're surrounded by media imagery, I just decided to begin to explore photography. I had friends who worked in photography, and I began to realize it was at that time we were working in the darkrooms, so each set, there were all these different steps, from capturing the image to processing the film to making the print, and there was something about the separation of those processes that seemed to lend itself it seemed to help me focus my vision and the way I wanted to create work. So I had done all different kinds of printmaking, oil painting, watercolor, life drawing, just the whole gamut of practices in two dimensions. And I really felt like there was something about that process that allowed me to communicate to my audience more clearly. And so I enjoy different kinds of technology. I mean, I've done lithography, I've done etching, and silkscreen, and I just find getting involved in processes, learning processes, to me is fascinating, and photography is constantly changing. So, and it connects to all aspects of our culture. So to me, it was both a subject matter and a method of working that was inexhaustible.
Right.
I'm always humbled by how much I don't know.
And it's immediate too, which you don't have to wait until you've developed what the series is going to be and then paint it and all of that, and then not have it be relevant anymore or something along those lines. Yeah, well, it's I tend to work somewhat intuitively, and I find that when I started working with photography, I told myself I wanted to make a photograph that didn't look like a photograph. So that's kind of always been my approach. I've always done a lot of stage photography, been very interested in, exploring ambiguous space, which is something that's part of my current work. And there's the dialogue that photography has with printmaking and with painting. Those are areas that I've mined, as well as thinking about sculptural form. Yeah, and it's no surprise that you started as a painter, because more often than not, when somebody approaches one of your works for the first time, they assume it's a painting. Yeah. And I find that to be the coolest thing. A compliment, and also just like it's wow, They do render themselves in a painterly way, and or you render them in a painterly way.
And then the fact that it's also a sculpture is quite amazing too. So you're setting a scene and then documenting the scene and making like this gorgeous, artwork out of it. It's really, really fantastic.
Well, thank you. And I've been, often the challenge, I think, in photography, especially working the way I do, is asking the question, what shall I photograph with the infinite number of objects in the world or of subjects in the world? And on occasion, I will struggle with that and, feel, especially when I come to the end of a series. And one thing that I've come back to is considering objects or experiences that are around me. And so that's how I've always kind of found the way into the next series. So with some of the current work, when I moved to Richardson, recycling was like, it was really easy to do. And I realized I had these accumulation of objects that I hadn't really thought about before. So in a way, when you're encountering all this stuff that before you threw away, it just disappeared, it made it, it became a material that I felt I had to confront or deal with because it was accumulating in my house. So,
Wow.
Yeah, and so, the city made it very easy to recycle, and I started to realize how much stuff over not just every week, but over the course of my life I've thrown away, and it's in landfills now. And so that was kind of an interesting aspect of the project, because ultimately if you want to photograph objects, you either need to possess them or you need to purchase them. And I have been someone who's always been interested in going to estate sales because I can have a dialogue with a previous owner who for some reason saved an object over decades that now has no value to anyone except for me because I want to photograph it. But I'm just fascinated by what do we save? What do we throw away? And that also connects to art. Why does this art have value? Why does this other creative object not have value, and how do objects acquire value, and just all those kinds of questions. And so, and in the context of recycling, it's kind of like these are objects that really, for a good number of us, well, of course they don't have any value, and it takes time for us to collect them and think about sorting them and recycling them. And so I'm interested in that whole dynamic again of what we save, what we throw away, and how it enters into a larger context.
Well, right. And for one, it's very sustainable, the practice that you're doing right now, because you're creating these goods by consuming the soda or the beer or whatever it might be, or someone else's, and then you're giving it a new life, extending, I guess, its lifespan before it enters the recycling process, which is really kind of cool.
Sure.
When I look at them, I think about artists who use various different media in their work, and how something like Boom and Kim, who uses thread, or Sonali Kadi, who uses felted wool, these various colors that appear in their work in various media just become part of their palette.
Sure.
And so when I see your works and I see the reds and the blues and the greens, I kind of think of, and I might be right, that you're pulling from this palette of color and shape as you're going through the detritus or whatever.
Yeah. Well, and that's kind of part of it. So most of the objects I was recycling previously were, I was photographing in black and white, and they were clear or neutral color, plastic bottles or milk bottles, or cardboard boxes that I would turn inside out. And I specifically like to have them be neutral. And as I was both walking around my neighborhood and also visiting some of this, parks and streams near where I live, I realized there was an accumulation of aluminum cans, and they're bright and they're reflective, and they're the color is saturated, and even though years go by, they still exist. And I was also reflecting, out of any material that, as an average consumer, you can recycle, aluminum also has inherent value. So because I was interested in working in color, I decided, okay, when I take a walk around my neighborhood, I would see aluminum cans everywhere. I just started to pick them up. And so I got a variety of different objects that I would know, I wouldn't necessarily have, a beer or a high energy drink, things like that. And so I would find all these different colors and different brands, and there's also tea, can in a can, and Starbucks in a can, and so I was just fascinated by all these objects I would pick up, and I'd also see them in the streams. And then after it rains, they would kind of disappear, and that's because they all go into the storm drains and down into our streams. So I've also done a series where I actually document where I find some of the cans sort of in, especially when there was a drought in our local streams. So it's kind of acknowledging that, and we know plastics break up, but the aluminum, it kind of persists. And I was interested in that because it's so persistent and so visible. And so I was kind of interested in that as just another variation of thinking about, objects we consume. And then over time, I've realized that aluminum is has a very complex, it's a very complex part of our economy. And so that sort of added to the whole, to my thought process as well.
It is, isn't it? We get in trade wars, for aluminum, from what I understand.
Well, one thing is that one aspect of aluminum that I've learned about is that a lot of energy is required to process bauxite ore, which is the source of aluminum, and both to generate aluminum and also to recycle it takes energy.
Wow.
And so that's kind of a hidden cost. And then we don't necessarily recycle that much of our aluminum, and then consumption rates appear to be going up. So it's complex, and I'm just kind of fascinated by, I recently read a book by Mimi Scheller, and it's called Aluminum Dreams, which is pretty funny. And she talks a lot about how aluminum is a metal of speed, and she talks about how aluminum is magic. And the whole notion of aluminum, it's part of aerodynamics. It influences the design of airplanes and automobiles, and we all have smartphones and laptops, and it's just so much a part of our everyday life. Building construction, food packaging, it's just, we encounter it everywhere. I really hadn't thought about it to that degree. And so that kind of caused me pause to think about, what is my place within this whole exchange. And also, Mimi Scheller talks about how we need to become re-enchanted with aluminum, because it was such a prized metal in the modern era, and now we just kind of take it for granted.
Oh, completely.
Yeah, and that there is such a complex relationship to the environment because of the way, in terms of mining and everything, how it affects the environment, and as well as the energy required to process it. So there are a lot of these negative and positive aspects of aluminum, so I find it really fascinating. I find it fascinated that I encounter it walking down the street. And then in some communities you don't really see it because it's also used as a form of currency for individuals who might be homeless. So that's what I meant. It's so odd that something that's so commonplace that. I remember being in Venice at a Vaporetto stop, and here's this beautiful scenery, and there's this aluminum can sitting on right there at the pier, and there's something about the way that we encounter it in our everyday lives all the time, and we don't really think about it, but it's connected to global trade and how we think about our environment. And so in that sense, it's been kind of a fascinating exploration.
So when you're working with, and there's some images, excuse me. Excuse me. Okay, so there's some images on screen, and when you're working with a composition like this, are you thinking about, was there a fishbowl in there?
It is a variation of a fishbowl. Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
I did not notice that until then. When you're working with these materials, are you thinking about, those larger implications as you're working?
Well, some of the recent work, I've decided I have all my my collection organized by hue.
Oh, great.
And I kind of like a palette. And I decided for this show, I decided to emphasize red, white, and blue.
Okay.
And so to kind of have a dialogue with consumerism and how, as American consumers, we make a number of decisions, and how we think about the decisions that we make in terms of consumption can have an impact, collectively, and so. So it's not so much that I espouse a major transformation in our society as much as my hope would be to prompt people just to be more aware of how on a daily basis they consume different kinds of materials, or in terms of how many products we purchase, and then do we reuse those products? Do we resell them? Do we throw them away? And it's just, I think we're all part of this. We're all part of that stream of commodities.
It would be really embarrassing for someone to know how many Diet Cokes I go through in a week. And at my residence, they don't recycle.
Oh, okay.
So I carry these massive bags filled mostly with diet soda cans to the trash, a couple times a week.
Yeah.
And it's just wild.
Yeah. Well, you just have to find a place to recycle. But it is true that I've talked to friends who live in communities. The community doesn't have any recycling because it's not economically viable. And then for some apartments or the building where my studio is, there's no recycling, so I have to carry my recycling home. Yeah. So it is one of the, we're going through transformation, and the good news is that I think we're just much more aware, and there's been more attention given to the whole process. And that's one aspect. With the work that I'm doing, I really try to think about Mimi Scheller's kind of encouragement to become re-enchanted with our relationship with aluminum. I really am trying to take this material that conventionally we just think of garbage, it's useless, we don't have any, it has no function anymore, and to transform it and make it really beautiful, and also using the reflective backgrounds to kind of suggest that it is a material with potential. It's a material that can be recast into something new.
Yeah.
And it's when we stop and reflect on that, it's like I think we all have to do it. Even though I'm conscious of it, I go, okay, I have to find a place to recycle this because I don't see a recycling bin anywhere.
Yeah.
So I think it's just kind of a consciousness, and the space that I create in many of the images is very ambiguous, and so the goal is kind of create a space that's somewhat mesmerizing and kind of draws the viewer in, and then maybe over time they'll reflect on, here's this object that I never see. And plastic is the same way. I mean, plastic water bottles, they're clear, they disappear.
Yeah.
You don't even think they're there, and it's the same thing. We know that plastics have this incredible negative impact on the environment. And we're all becoming, and the issue with the title of the show is I'm also thinking about that, for example, we would go to a store and we wouldn't worry about bringing recyclable bags, and now it's like, okay, I have to bring my bags. That's not convenient.
Right.
But it's part of what we know we need to do.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing with recycling. It's not convenient to recycle. You have to remember, you have to slow down. It takes time. It's not really compensated labor, but it's something, if everyone participates, it can have a real impact on our environment, our everyday experience. And I really kind of enjoy some of the news stories recently about groups of joggers and other individuals who get together and they pick up all the litter and the trash. And I'm like, that is really cool. It's just
That
sort
is
of
cool.
like collectively people realizing this is our space. And
Yeah,
we need to take ownership of it. And there's various different ways to do that, but the more we become aware of the decisions we make as individuals, it does have a reverberation effect, I think.
So there's definitely an element of social action in your art, because you are kind of causing pause for people, and ultimately the goal is to get them to start paying attention.
Sure, yeah. And I think that we all can make different decisions that fit our particular lives, as far as whether we take mass transit, what kind of vehicle we have, how close we live to our workplace. They're all different kinds of decisions that we can make, but I think if everyone finds the best way that they can make a contribution or have somewhat of an impact, I think that can really prompt change. And I have to reflect on when we had the drought in North Texas. Now we're not worrying about the drought, which is wonderful. But during that time, suddenly there were new regulations where you could only water your lawn at certain times
Right.
of day or certain days of the week. And at first it seemed really restrictive, but over time it's like, well, we didn't need to water our lawns that much. We didn't need to water every day. And the idea was, once collectively everyone came together and began to become more conscious of water use, that allows the urban area of the whole North Texas Metroplex to grow.
Yeah.
Because if you don't have water, you can't have growth. So I was just reflecting on that experience, that in terms of my project, it becomes somewhat more symbolic of all the kinds of different objects we consume, and it just reveals one aspect of it, of the whole. So.
And it's quite beautiful, too.
Oh, thank you.
So, well, we're kind of out of time. I'd like everyone to come and view the show. It's on May 25th, which is next Saturday, at Row 2 Art, downtown pop-up, at 1508 Commerce Street, across from the Jewel. The show will be up into till the end of June as well, but 7 to 10 on Saturday the 25th, and there'll be probably nearly a dozen new works.
Yes.
Yeah, it'll be quite interesting. And thank you so much for joining us and joining me, and had a nice conversation.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Jordan.
You bet.
I appreciate it. Yeah.
All right.